Naomi, over to you.
Thanks very much, Nick. Hope you can all hear me okay. If you do have any questions, I can't see any chats or anything while I'm talking. So if we just afterwards, I'm happy enough to go through anything, take a note of it, and we'll talk about it after. So I am this project sort of born out of my PhD. I ended up discovering or reading a lot of stuff about historical communities in Northern Ireland. And I now I'm running a Black History project with Northwest Migrants Forum, and really just want to highlight it's really a snapshot. Just this is a couple of stories to highlight that Northern Ireland is not and has not always been a purely two communities society. Um, this photo is actually from 1978. It's one of the founding members of the Islamic Centre in Belfast. Um, so it's just to try and make people think about Northern Ireland in a different way, and the history of Northern Ireland in a slightly different way. Um, we talk about ethnic minorities. What we mean is really minoritized people, because in the global scale, they're not minorities. But when they come to Northern Ireland, they suddenly become part of a minority because they're not part of the two dominant communities, if you like. Um, and the whole pattern of migration really has to be seen in a wider global context. Particularly at the moment, we're talking about refugees, people coming here to seeking sanctuary. That's part of a wider conversation in Europe and in the UK and in Ireland, that is also in Northern Ireland. So it's looking at the global context. And as I said, it's really important that we realise we don't talk about new communities all the time, because there is this historical presence in Northern Ireland, and it's largely been overlooked. Obviously, the Troubles have been the main focus when we talk about certainly recent history, 20th century history. And in particular, the Northern Ireland census didn't even record ethnicity really until 2001. So there's a big gap in the data as to who actually lived here. And a lot of the stories then are coming through families and anecdotally and local history rather than statistics from government. As I said, minority communities are very diverse. There's no single monolithic community, and they're constantly evolving. And we've seen that over the past number of years with the arrival of refugees and asylum seekers from different countries. And these are all being affected by immigration patterns globally, war globally, settlement, and local and international politics. So who already is here can influence who comes here as well. In the terms of Northern Ireland, we class everybody as another. If you're not a PUL, Protestant Unionist Loyalist, or CNR, Catholic Nationalist Republican, you're another. And that can also sometimes make people think that this is a single group with a single mindset. But really, everybody's experience will be incredibly diverse, which is why I'm saying this is just a snapshot, and it won't reflect the full diversity of what it is to be Northern Irish or to live in Northern Ireland. We're talking about different ethnicities, cultures, nationalities, religion, sects, and different influences, immigration patterns, socioeconomic class, and education levels. So there's a lot here. I'm coming at this from the approach of decolonizing the curriculum, which is a kind of a buzzword or a buzz catchphrase that has been used a lot. And sometimes people think that means, oh, we don't talk about the British Empire, we don't talk about, it's hiding history, but it's about making history inclusive, recognizing that we only hear or have heard historically one narrative. And we want to make space to see that there is a bigger world out there, and there's more to history than sometimes what we've been taught in school. Recognizing that Europe in particular, and Ireland as well, has actually been much more culturally diverse than we often admit. And that's particularly true in Northern Ireland, where we're talking about nationalities of the same colour, like the Huguenots, who have a massive influence coming from France, and Italians in Northern Ireland. For example, what would Northern Ireland be without Morellis or without Barrys? Italian families that settled here and became part of Northern Irish society. It's about recognising that there have been Black, Asian, and other ethnic minorities in the UK and Ireland for centuries, not just since the 1960s. And it's also about recognising the legacy of slavery and colonialism both globally and locally. I just last night I was for my project that I'm doing, I was looking up some of the records of people who had owned slaves who lived in Ireland, and I discovered that my great aunt's husband's family were one of those. They were quite a wealthy farming family in County Donegal, and it turned out that they had a share in a Jamaican slave plantation and had received a payout from the British government. And I had none of us had any idea. And last night I just discovered it's a very distinctive name in the town, and it turned out to be someone who was distantly related. So sometimes these stories can be very local, even though it's a global thing. Sorry, some of my animations are a bit mixed up there because I changed some slides just before I came on. So a lot of this is coming from, when we're talking about decolonization, we're talking about this concept of Western civilization versus the East and the exoticness and all this kind of narratives. And that idea really didn't start to appear until the 1890s. And that there was a belief that there was these very neat line, there was the East and the West. But that really ignores centuries of complex systems of trade, communication, exchange between different people. At the end of the day, we all know that tea did not come from Yorkshire. We knew, if we think about it, we know. But there's sometimes we sort of think about the world in these divisions rather than realizing it's a complex and interconnected world, even before we had planes and the steamboats and that kind of thing. Also, particularly in Europe, we often think of white sort of Western, maybe British culture or European culture to be sort of the unique inheritors of Greek and Roman culture, which ignores the fact that both the Greek and Roman empires comprised of territory and peoples that encompass not only Europe, but also parts of Africa and Asia. And that those actual classics of philosophy and literature, a lot of that came to Europe via the Arabs and the Persians during the Middle Ages, who preserved and built on those works. And then during the Renaissance, it came back to Europe. So again, it's that whole idea that we're really interconnected. Back to the UK and Britain, we were certainly, I've actually just heard about this being taught in a school recently in Northern Ireland just in the past month. But I thought we'd all move past this, but unfortunately we're not. Historically, a lot of people were taught that there were 5 races of man, and this is how society was divided, and a lot of that differentiation was actually based on that concept that people were physically different. There's actually no biological basis for that. There's no anthropological basis for that. Two people who are black-skinned individuals could be as distantly related, closely related to someone with white skin. There's so much difference and variations within populations. You can't just look at someone and say they belong to these categories, because the human race just simply doesn't work like that. Biology simply doesn't work like that. So this sort of differentiation between black or non-white or white, these were really constructed during the early modern period. And they were used to justify slavery, colonialism, and racism. Because if you say that somebody is worthless or is a subhuman, then it's much easier to justify things like the transatlantic slave trade, which is what happened. So, sorry. But another thing we tend to do, in particularly in a little bit in the British Isles, but particularly Ireland, because we're sort of this little island on the far side of Europe, we think that we're a place apart. Nobody came here, and we were just this sort of isolated population. But that's not true. That's not the case. Back as early as 845 AD, we had, obviously the Vikings had a significant city down in Dublin. And there were the Umayyad rulers from the Middle East came down on a diplomatic mission to the Vikings and came to discuss terms with the Vikings. Early Arab and Persian cartographers had Ireland on their maps, and they had descriptions of the Irish people as well. Some of them a little bit fanciful, but they talked about the red skin, which I must say is very true of me today in this heat. But so Ireland was known in Europe and in the Middle East. Moorish geographer Al-Udri, he actually wrote a very, very detailed description of whaling, which was off the coast of Ireland back in 1058 AD. So, 1,000 years ago. This was literally on the map. Some of the cartographers also came to the British Isles. We know they went, that Al-Idrisi travelled to York. We don't know if he came as far as Ireland, but he certainly gave very detailed descriptions of both Ireland and Scotland. He may have heard it from someone and it was repeating it, or he may have gone himself. That's something we're not entirely clear of. This is actually one of the maps. This is the Al-Idrisi world map. It's upside down, and he didn't realize that Scotland and England were connected, because he probably, if he did go, he would have sailed around. But there was you've got to understand it's orientated if you turn it up. But we were on the map quite literally. There are other evidences of trade links. Back in 2019, somebody discovered this little fragment. It was actually used to line another book. It was in Irish, and they decided to get it translated, and it turned out to be an Irish translation of a very famous Persian work by Ibn Sina. Oh, sorry. His Canon of Medicine, and it was translated into Irish. We know that there were Celtic physicians from Dalriada, certainly the Scottish side, possibly also from the Ulster side, who travelled to Andalusia, which was owned at that point by the Moorish. It was part of the Moorish Empire rather than the European Empire. They were training there as doctors, and possibly that Irish people went there as well. There's a little picture, it's not very clear. This little cross was found in Cork. Again, Cork was a great trading town. It was actually, not that far to sail from Cork down to Morocco. And they found this little Celtic cross, which has a little jewel, which is in Arabic Kufi script. It says Bismillah, which means in the name of God. So there's these little hints of connections. They're little snippets of time that show that there was these wider links. Back in the 11th century, the annals of Ireland, there's sort of little fragments of history that were written down. They talk about this fantastic story of how the Vikings, based in Dublin, went to what's now Morocco. It says, I think they call it Mali, and no, not Mali. It's got the raw. It's a different name, but it's modern day Morocco. And they carried a group of people, which they called the Blue Men, which can be either translated as the Blue Men or the Black Men. The Blue Men, possibly relating to the Tuareg. If you've ever seen the Tuareg in Morocco and North Africa, they were the blue turbans and the blue clothes. But they were believed to be people of African origin who remained a distinct group and eventually married in to the wider population and became part of Irish society over time. We also know that there were the Romans never came to Ireland, but we know that there are people of African ancestry, mainly North African, because there were entire Moorish units within the Roman legions, but also Ethiopians who lived and died in England, in Britain, and in Scotland. There's also other records of individuals in medieval times living in Britain, in particular. Black people were represented in paintings of Henry VIII. And then by the time we got to Elizabethan times, there was censuses that show that there were quite a significant number of people from different backgrounds, particularly Black people and what they called Turks, which was essentially anyone from the Ottoman Empire. So they could be from modern day Turkey, modern day Syria, anywhere sort of in that whole area. And it became such an issue in English society that Elizabeth I even wrote a proclamation complaining about the number. Sounds very familiar. So, sometimes there's nothing new under the sun. But when we get to the 17th and 18th centuries, then we really begin to get more sort of solid stories and evidences, and even people writing their own stories about their life in the cultural narrative of Britain and Ireland. So one thing that sometimes surprises people is the link, the Elizabethan links. That's one of the reasons there were so many people in Elizabethan England, was because of the trade links and the diplomatic links. Queen Elizabeth was obviously a Protestant. She was isolated within Catholic Europe, so she was at war essentially with Spain and a lot of the Catholic, very powerful states in Southern Europe. So who did she trade with? With the Muslim empires, who were also at war with the Catholic Spain. So there was a very significant trade deal between Queen Elizabeth and the Ottoman Sultan, which lasted from 1583 right up until the fall of the Ottoman Empire in 1922. So it was a really huge, deal that lasted for centuries. The Ottoman Sultan was also making deals with Flanders and William of Orange over in Holland as well during the Dutch Revolt. So it wasn't just England, there was these different trade links and allegiances and alliances that were being made. England had resident ambassadors in Constantinople, which is in Istanbul, of course, throughout North Africa and the Middle East, including names that you probably know from the news since the Syrian war, Aleppo and Raqqa in Syria. In 1600, the Moroccan ambassador actually came for 6 months to try and form an allegiance with Morocco. So there's different empires. The Ottoman Empire was based around Turkey, and then you had the Moroccan Empire and also the Iranian, the Persians. And Elizabeth did deals with them all. But the Moroccan wanted to specifically go to war against Spain. It didn't work out, but they had other trade links instead. Okay. So as well as people coming to the UK and Britain, and it wasn't UK at that stage, coming to Britain, Irish people were quite prolific abroad, shall we say. Slavery was banned in Ireland, so there was no slave ships were allowed to land in Ireland. However, there were indirect links to Ireland. Quite a few Irish merchants profited from the trade. Some of them, really, Belfast bloomed because of the trade. Whenever initially that everything had to go, all the products from slave plantations had to go to English ports and then were distributed throughout Britain and Ireland. But whenever they opened Ireland to the trade, the provisioners also were landing in Belfast, in Cork, and in Dublin as well. And that's when we really began to see people they were building shoes that were going out to the West Indies, linen clothes that were going to the West Indies, sugar and rum was coming straight into Belfast ports. So it became quite an industry. So it wasn't directly, there were not slave boats like Bristol and Liverpool coming in to the ports, but there were certainly trade and wealth coming from that. There were people who are from Ireland or had connections to Ireland who owned plantations. As I said, we discovered last night one of my actual relatives, or by marriage, who would have had shares in the West Indies and in slave plantations. We know that 107 people who were recorded as living in Ireland, some of them were absentee landlords, to be fair. They weren't all actually in Ireland, who were compensated at the time, so the losses. So whenever they broke, the British ended slavery in the UK, they paid the people who had enslaved people to release them, essentially. And 107 people living in Ireland were compensated for that. There were also, we have newspaper reports of runaway slaves. So we know that there were small numbers of enslaved people in Ireland, very small. We're talking a handful of people. But there was a number of people who came to Ireland seeking sanctuary because, particularly after the slave trade ended in the UK, if you were enslaved in America or in the West Indies and you managed somehow to get to Britain or Ireland, you were automatically free. Now, you were still officially owned by somebody in that plantation and they could petition for you to be removed. And there's quite a famous story of a guy called William Allen who was supported by the United Irishmen and actually went to court because his owner wanted him to go back, essentially. And he was widely supported and he was protected and he ended up living in Belfast. So we had a number of stories like that where people were coming to Ireland and became part of the Irish society and married in and just eventually became part of society. But as well as slavery, a number of quite a large number of Irish men, sometimes accompanied by their wives and children, right across the British Empire, particularly in India, with the East India Company, but also in the West Indies. My own great-great-grandfather was a medic in Barbados. So, and he had brought my great-grandfather and his wife and his brothers and sisters in with him as well. So sometimes people have connections. They've come back to Ireland at some point, but these connections, sometimes when you do your family history, as I have, you find these little gems. Um, so by the mid 1800s, 42% of the British Army were Irish. So Irish people who were born in Ireland who were working for the British Army, or sometimes in private armies. Different companies had private armies to protect their trade as well. So as I said, I give some examples there. People of Black heritage have lived in small numbers since the 18th century, and it's mainly around these port cities, around Limerick, Cork, and Dublin, but also eventually in Belfast as well. Some of them were, after slavery was ended, were still brought by their employers at that point, whether they were from India or in the West Indies, to come and work for them, either on a permanent or temporary basis. Now, it may not always have been entirely voluntary. They may not have had always the most options, but officially they were free men and women who came. We know that there was quite a number of people who came as servants, footmen, nannies, or ayahs, particularly those from India, called ayahs, or maids to wealthy families. And they appear in portraits, and they appear in household notes. And a lot of the time they were given English names, and they were baptized into the Christian faith if they weren't born into the Christian faith. But there's still these records and stories throughout that. It was considered very fashionable. It sounds awful now, but that was seen to, I'm wealthy because I've got this this servant or this manservant or this maid from Africa, from India, from wherever, because it showed that you were wealthy, you had a high social standing. Sadly, because of the social standing, most of their names and stories are lost, either because they've been renamed or they're just simply labeled as, manservant, and maybe his country of origin or whatever. Those that we do know of are largely those who became infamous. William Allen is one example. That's the guy who the United Irishmen helped to stay in Belfast. Tony Small, who is the man in this picture, and this is a 1772 painting. He was actually he had fought for the North in the American Civil War, and he fought alongside Lord Fitzwilliam from the United Irishmen, and he saved his life. So he ended up coming over with him as his manservant, and he stayed and lived in Ireland, and married an Irish woman and had a family. There's other ones we don't know how people came here all the time, but we just get these little snippets. As it tends to be people who are infamous. A man who was known as George Henry Thompson, who was described as a black man who lived among the Protestants of the Shankill, was part of a riot of 100 people. And there was a fight basically between Protestants and Catholics, and he was the only one who was charged and fined for this. I don't know why him particularly. Maybe they singled him out because of he was different. He was more easy to catch. I'm not sure. But he's recorded in the papers as having received a fine and 2 years imprisonment for inciting this riot. So, I said infamous people, but there's also the other people that we hear about then are the people who've made some kind of achievement or, become somebody very notable, usually by writing books. Dean Mahatma, he was again another manservant for a member of the Irish gentry. He initially came to Cork, married a local Irish woman, had a family, and he became popular because he wrote a book about his life before he came to Ireland and his experiences in the British Army. And he became a bit of a celebrity in his time. Eventually moving to England, and he opened one of the first Indian restaurants in London in 1801. I think people think about Indian restaurants being open in 1960 or 1950s or something, but 1801, the first Indian restaurant in London. Mir Ulad Ali, he was a really remarkable character. He moved to Ireland. He was already an academic. He was a respected academic. He was working already in Britain, and he was asked to come to Ireland to work in Trinity College as a language professor. A lot of the Irishmen who were going out to work in India wanted to learn a bit of the language before they left. So Hindustani and Persian were actually key languages that they were learning before they actually went out. So that if they were taking officer positions, they would be able to, advance that little bit more. So he came over in 1861. And he not only took an interest in, of course, the languages that he spoke and was teaching to his students, he took a fantastic interest in the Irish language and was a very, very active member in the preservation of Irish. And he wrote a lot of articles about promoting language and stuff. So he married an English woman, but he continued to live in Ireland because he'd married before he came to Ireland. But he continued to live in Ireland until his death, and he's buried in a graveyard down in Dublin. Of course, a lot of the stories we hear are the stories of men. It's common in history. The men are the ones who tend to, have been more heard in society, I guess. And this is often true, particularly when we're talking about migrant and minority women. There's this idea that the men come, and if the women come, they come as sort of little helpers in the background, and they're kind of almost invisible. And I think it's a reflection of women's position in society as well in history. And again, they tend to appear only at the sort of passing references, often due to scandal, because they've been accused of prostitution or something sort of salacious. But they also came for other reasons. And these women are kind of probably some of the most famous. Sarah Forbes, she was gifted to Queen Victoria, and she ended up becoming kind of her mentee. Victoria Randall is another one. She was one of the heiresses from the West Indies. And Dido Elizabeth Bell, she was as well. Some of these people, they were actually the children of gentry who had gone to, visit their plantations and had illegitimate children. And then they sent their children back, both to Ireland and to England to be educated. And they really taught them to become, British, to become a very particular type of person. They had to follow the cultural norms, the expected traditions of not only Christianity but also gentility and carry that status. So they really, yes, they may have looked visibly different, but largely to assimilate into British or Irish society, and that's why they were coming home. Some of them were actually, they put clauses in their wills that their son or daughter, when they came to Britain or Ireland to get educated, that they had to stay there. And if they went back to Jamaica or went back to Montserrat or wherever they were from, that they would lose any inheritance. So it was like they wanted them to come and become British and become fit into high society, essentially. Two more distinct women who were here in Ireland, and there's Princess Nazir Begum. She married Thomas Alexander Cobb, who was a man from Dublin, who was his family connected with Newbridge House. They became popular because they had a number of collections from Indian and Mughal empires of paintings, miniatures that they put on display. Another lady, this isn't actually her, I should say this is a contemporary, but they tend to use this image for her. There's, whether that's a good thing, I'm not sure, but we know a lot about her from her music. She was a singer. She sung extensively in Dublin, and she was very big on the Irish stage. And then she came up north, and she had a concert in Belfast. So she seemed to have spent a lot of time in Dublin and done a few small tours. But then in her later life, she came up to Belfast. She had a very extensive period. She married a violinist called Mr. Crowe. And together they did a series of concert and balls in the assembly rooms in Belfast, which some of you may know, but also in various locations like Carrickfergus and Patrick and Lisburn. So it was a very extensive tour across the whole winter. The last concert that we know took place in April 1773. And after that, we don't know what happened to her. We don't know what happened to her, how she died, or anything more about her. But again, it's these wee snapshots that we get in newspaper articles and advertisements and things that tell us about these individuals. Another key way that people came to these shores was through sailing. From the 16th century, the British and other European countries heavily relied on non-European sailors to work on their ships. Primarily, they were from Asia, but also a lot were from North Africa and Yemen, Egypt, Somalia, as well. And they travel across the world with the British merchant fleet. And it could not have functioned. And even today, we have fishermen in Kilkeel from Ghana. So the maritime economy has often been fueled by the labour from people from other countries, even if the ships are officially British or whatever. By 1855, as many as 12,000 Lascars were arriving in British and Irish ports annually. So really significant numbers. And when we get to World War One, 1914, it was nearly 1 in 6 seamen in the British Merchant Navy were Lascars. So they were from either the Middle East, Africa, or Asia. By World War Two, that number had jumped to 25%. And even again today, the British Army still has a significant number of people from different countries who are not actually born in Britain. So around 25% came from India and East Asia, and 5% then came from Caribbean, Middle East, and Africa. So a very significant portion of the war effort at sea alone was done by people of different ethnic backgrounds. And we know that some of them landed in Belfast. There's a record of a ship in 1942, I think it was rescued at sea, and nearly every single crew member had an Asian Muslim name, to be honest. So they're landing in Belfast. They're part of the story of Belfast. Unfortunately, they often faced very harsh conditions and overt discrimination. They had different rules for Lascars and for white British and Irish seamen. As a result, some of them jumped ship and they couldn't hack it anymore. They came to a port and they didn't go back on the boat. Others were abandoned. They would have a quota of how many they could have per ship, and if they couldn't go back on the ship, then they just left them at the port. Sadly, the conditions, because they were so bad, and that was for all sailors, some of them died as well, and others were left destitute at ports. My own research, I found 10 Lascars buried in Belfast City Cemetery in unmarked graves. There's probably more, but that's the ones that I've uncovered, that there's 10 names, and I've been to the graves, I've found the plot, and not a single one of them are in a marked grave, so there's no record of them in the city. There's also records I found at workhouses in Belfast of sort of very kind of tragic stories where they were literally left destitute, and a lot of the guys who died did die in workhouses because they had nowhere else to go. There's a very sad one where they tried to petition the ship owners, and there was 3 of them. One was a child, and he was on the street, and the 2 men were in a workhouse. But the judge said he can't rule because it was a maritime issue, and so there's no resolution to that story. It was just kind of a sad story that they said they couldn't. The conclusion was he couldn't help. So what happened then? Whether they died, whether they were able to get away, I don't know. We do know that some of them married, started families with English and Irish women. And in fact, the Yemeni, Indian, and Somali Lascars who settled particularly in Cardiff, in Newcastle, they're the foundations of some of the oldest continuous Muslim communities in the UK and Ireland, and here in Northern Ireland as well. Some of the Lascars came in the 1920s, and their families are still in Belfast and in Northern Ireland 4 or 5 generations later. So bringing up a little bit closer, I think it's really important that we acknowledge that the Irish traveller community has been a distinct community. When we talk about minorities, we often forget the traveller community is considered an ethnic minority in Northern Ireland, and they've lived here for at least 1,000 years as a distinct community. As I said, we also had the Huguenots who came from France in the 1600s. And they tried to keep the traditions alive. They didn't suddenly come and become like everybody else. They spoke French. They kept their language up until the 1800s, and they played a big part in the various fabric manufacturers here in Ireland, Northern Ireland in particular. Of course, the Jewish community absolutely made a huge impact on the city of Belfast in particular. Um, there are earlier records of Irish Jews. So they didn't all come in 1870s, but that was when the biggest group came, and a lot of them became, part of intrinsic part of the city. We had other European migrants, as I said earlier, including the Italian families, including Morelli's, the Trufelli family, Barry's. And then we began to see sort of 1920s and 30s Indian and Pakistani immigrants coming. The earliest ones came as Lascars. They jumped ship. And they began to settle, and then the community grew because people knew, oh, my cousin lives there, and they came. And as chain migration is a very common way that people came to Ireland. Someone was here already, and then somebody came to join them and work in the family business. Both Indian and Pakistani communities were very much involved with the clothing trade, again, not the manufacture, but more the sales side. Back in rural Northern Ireland, best way to sell clothes to a housewife was go door to door, and they were known for it. Again, it was one of the things that was actually mentioned in Stormont at the time. And after that, many of them then went on to set up official clothing businesses and department stores and warehouses. And there's some families still in the clothing trade and do the markets. Again, 3 or 4 generations on, so family traditions have continued, and family businesses. We also know that Arab and African doctors, and Indian doctors, so I should say as well, and students began to arrive in Northern Ireland from the 1930s to Queen's. And of course, the Chinese community, the largest non-EU community for most of the time, most of the recent sort of couple of decades anyway, they were the biggest minority community. And they were very heavily involved in the catering trade here. The Peacock was the first Chinese restaurant, again, 1962, not 1960, not 1990s or after the ceasefires, 1962. And again, chain migration, people were coming to work in the businesses, and they were saying, this is a great model, people love it. And they were open in towns across Belfast, and then smaller towns as well. So a big part of Northern Irish society was built, and businesses were built by migrant people who came in those days. And some of them were coming through the Troubles when other people weren't coming. Irish people were leaving, and they were coming and filling gaps. However, the migration, as we see in recent days, in recent weeks and months, with a lot of the narratives around refugees, it wasn't, again, nothing new under the sun. It wasn't always an easy thing for people to come. British government began to put rules to try and stop people coming from 1905 when they had the Aliens Act, largely to control the Jewish immigration. Jewish people were being persecuted a lot in Eastern Europe, and that's why they were coming. And they wanted to stop it. They began to panic about the numbers. And they said it was about criminality and all that, but really it was prejudice and anti-Semitism. They didn't want Jewish population to come. And also the Lascars, they didn't want people to come to port and settle down and end up marrying local women. And this became almost a crisis by 1914. And I mean, a moral panic rather than a genuine crisis. A lot of British and Irish women were marrying people who had settled here from different ethnic backgrounds. So the British Nationality Act was introduced to not only restrict those individuals, but any British woman who married someone who was not British would lose her British nationality, and the children would lose her British nationality. So they were really trying to stop the marriages as well. And again, you can say 25% of the British Navy were from non-white backgrounds, so you can see why they were beginning to introduce these kind of rules. And because of this moral panic and these ideas that they had about racial mixing and different people being different races rather than just one big human race. So they introduced in the 1926, they really began to crack down on how people could work in the UK. So a lot of, particularly seamen, it was initially in the ports, and then they extended as people began to migrate out of those cities, to try and restrict their work. And of course, that had an impact on their families. If they'd married British nationals, the British national woman had lost her rights as well, and it affected their children, and it created this sort of cycle of poverty and economic disadvantage. And it also fed into stereotypes, because these families were poor. Oh, look, this is a mixed family, they're poor, that's because they're mixed, rather than because of the conditions that they were being forced to live in. And that wasn't revoked until 1942. So it was quite a considerable period of time from 1914 until 1942 that people were literally losing their citizenship because they had married someone from a different nationality. Okay, just quickly. Oh, sorry. A lot of people are surprised by some of these photos, because they think that, again, everybody came to Northern Ireland after the Troubles ended. But from the 1940s, we began to see significant numbers of students come from Africa, Pakistan, India, Middle East, China. And really that took a pace up in the 1960s. There were different scholarships were being offered. This particular group of Ugandan students came in 1963. They had a particular initiative for trainee teachers in Uganda, and there's beautiful newspaper reports of them going to schools in Green Island and doing dancing, and it was the kind of things you sort of see in schools now, and that our organisation does. They were doing that in 1963 in primary schools and things like that. And of course, when the Troubles broke out, a lot of those arrangements broke down, and that there was, it didn't continue. But a lot of people were still coming to work in the NHS and to work in the health service, particularly from the 1950s, when the NHS was set up. There were people were being recruited abroad to try and fill the gaps and the labour shortages that were needed. And it still applies today. As much as 30% of the NHS still relies on overseas recruitment. And we have doctors and nurses from minority and ethnic backgrounds here in Northern Ireland, and it numbers well into hundreds of, probably the thousands. So we very heavily rely on the skills and the labour of people from different backgrounds for our NHS to function. Another one that people are sometimes surprised about, back in the World War II, a lot of people know GIs were stationed here. American soldiers were stationed in Ireland. Because of segregation in America, they defined units for Black soldiers, and a couple of thousand were stationed across Ireland, mainly in Belfast, also Dunmurry, Antrim, Moneymore, and in County Armagh as well. So Bestbrook, forgot it there. So these were part, again, of the wartime story in Northern Ireland, and there's many stories about that, but we don't have time to go into all of them. Unfortunately, when we had students from different backgrounds, racial backgrounds, different soldiers coming and things like that, we also had babies. People had relationships, particularly when there were restrictions on how people could marry up until 1942. There was a lot of discrimination, there was a lot of prejudice, and of course, being an unmarried mother, a lot of women would have gone into mother and baby homes to give birth. Some of them travelled to England. There were particular homes in England actually set up for GI babies, for Black GI babies. There were a lot of GI babies, but the Black ones were obviously very distinct. And so they actually had one in Somerset dedicated only to babies that were going to be born Black. But there were also mixed race children in Ireland, in Irish mother and baby homes, in Northern Ireland's baby homes. Of course, there's a lot of interest in that at the moment. The collaborative report on mother and baby homes in Ireland, they didn't fully release their report, but there were some snippets that were released, and it's very depressing read, to say the least. Those who were passing as much as possible were encouraged to pretend they were white. They did not acknowledge as much as possible their identity, their culture. and where possible, they tried to pass the children off as white. Um, if they were, a lot of these fathers were professional men, but they were just named as an African. They maybe didn't have his name. They may have put his profession. Sometimes they actively prevented the father's family. Sometimes the father's family didn't want the child, but when they did, they sometimes actively prevented the children from going or being taken by the father's family, or from marriages, preventing marriages of the parents. It was very traumatic. And within that, there's a mixed race Irish society. I highly recommend going on their website. Um, just the mental health issues that has caused for people who are Irish but are mixed race and have not seen as Irish, but they are so disconnected from their cultural and racial heritage as well. Again, another big big piece of legislation was the Commonwealth Immigrants Act. Because people were coming in this chain migration, they were bringing people over, they tried to restrict that. Initially, they brought everyone over. We need doctors. We need to reconstruct the UK after the war. And then they were like, no, we've had enough. And they tried to restrict how people could come to the UK and the professions that they came in. So you could only come to work in a family restaurant, for example. You couldn't come, and that's why we got these. One of the reasons we had these generational businesses passed down, because that was the only way you could bring family to come. They had to sort of come and work in that profession, and it almost pigeonholed people. The Chinese are going to do the restaurants, and the Indians are going to do the clothing sales, and it almost meant that people were almost pigeonholed into these roles. So sorry. Of course, I have to say as well, the Troubles impacted everybody who lived here. It wasn't just the two communities. Many people were business owners, as I said, and they face threats, they face injury, they face loss of income, fire damage, bombs on their properties. It was a very powerful story, and one of the events we ran before, and a lady, she'd been here for 50, 60 years, originally came from India, and she was in the shop when her business was blown up, and one of the ladies who she'd just been talking to was killed in that explosion. So it's about recognizing as well that the Troubles impacted on everyone. There were at least 30 Troubles victims. A lot of them were soldiers, because again, the British soldiers were also ethnic minorities. A lot of them came from the Caribbean, but there were also civilians who were killed. Ashra Chopra was killed in Londonderry. She was pregnant when she got caught in crossfire. Her two children were with her in the car. They survived. Nurbaz Khan, he was a father of 5. He was Pakistani. He'd lived in Northern Ireland for about 12 years when he was killed. Muhammad Abdul Khalid, he was 18 years old, and he had come to, his dad had come over to work in the army, and he then was following in his father's footsteps. He was killed at the age of 18. He'd lived in Northern Ireland most of his life. And at the end there's Max Orlunda. He's the first and only Nigerian to be killed in the Troubles. He was in the Dunmurry train bombing. He was an accountant who was coming home from work when he was caught up in the explosion. And of course, minority doctors were working in the hospitals here as well. Mazhar Khan, he was one of the former, he's passed away now, but he was one of the former chairpeople of Belfast Islamic Centre. He was a cardiologist. Harith Lamke, still alive. He was one of the leading gynecologists, oncologists, obstetrics, in Northern Ireland. So again, contributing to society, and of course the British Army as well. They introduced race relations law in 1965 to protect minorities from racial discrimination, but it wasn't introduced in Northern Ireland. There was very little recognition that this was an issue here. But the reality is minorities have faced racism in Northern Ireland. It's often underplayed. But we did get race legislation in 1997, 32 years after the rest of the UK. But even despite that, since 2015, racial hate crimes have exceeded that of sectarian hate crime. This is BMCA. Some of you may know Donegal Pass in Belfast, it was burnt out twice, not just once, but twice. Overall, people in Northern Ireland from racial minority backgrounds have a lower level of protection against racial discrimination than the rest of the UK. There are some moves, very slow, to change our legislation, but at the moment it's very easy to commit a crime and get away with it. You're twice less likely to be convicted for a racial hate crime than any other crime. So a robbery, say it's like 20%, I think the rate is, and for racial hate crime it's 10% conviction, so it's half as likely. And of course, there's also the wonderful phenomenon we have in Northern Ireland, paramilitary groups sometimes being linked to the targeting of minority communities. According to the 2021 census, 13.5% of the population were born outside Northern Ireland. And we know that about 65, and that's just what's recorded, because reality, there's probably a lot of underreporting. About 3.4% of the population are from minority ethnic backgrounds, and that includes people born and raised in Northern Ireland. But it's really important that we don't just focus on those statistics. We don't just look at migrants in the context of visa categories or groupings, that we don't ignore the stories, the skills, and everything that they bring to the table and their contributions to Northern Ireland, not just in the present day, but also historically. There have been major changes, and we all, that we'll all say, oh, I didn't used to look like this 50 years ago, 20 years ago, whatever. Yes, there have been major changes in demographics, but it's also really important that we acknowledge the historical presence of different ethnic and religious groups who've been present in Northern Ireland for many decades, and in many cases before the formation of Northern Ireland itself. Their stories are a part of the history of Northern Ireland, not apart from it. It's not their history over there and our history over here. We're all connected, and our history is all connected. Particularly as it's Refugee Week, I think that's one of the reasons I want to highlight hate crime and racism, because it can really create a sense of isolation and alienation. We talk about integration of other people, but it's a two-way street. If we have weak legislation, no prosecutions, and no feeling of safety and belonging, people can't really integrate into our society. There's also some structural barriers to belonging through the immigration system, and this particularly applies to refugees and people seeking asylum. For someone who's come here as a child, as an asylum seeker, if they don't get status, they may have gone through school in Northern Ireland and they may have got Northern Irish accents and all their friends from Northern Ireland, but they may not then have permission to work until they get their status granted, or to go into full-time education, particularly those who want to go into health. There's a lot of restrictions on who can do that. And also generally, anti-immigration sentiment, particularly that from the highest level, whenever Rishi Sunak is saying stop the boats, it can impact on all immigrants and ethnic minorities, because ultimately, if someone sees me on the street and I'm a white Irish person who wears hijab, they tell me to go home. They tell me to speak English, because there's a general assumption that people who look like me are not from here. We also tend to use the terms newcomer community, but this again ignores there's existing minority communities and generations into which these individuals also integrate. And also, when does someone stop being a newcomer? Because I have friends who've been here for 12 years, 15 years, 20 years, who are still sometimes referred as newcomers. And this whole two communities other thing, this is a binary which doesn't really acknowledge the diversity that now exists in Northern Ireland, and discounts this whole part of a community as other. We have fourth and fifth generation people who great-grandparents or grandparents came to Northern Ireland still being asked, where are you from? Where are you really from? So I'm going to leave you with a question, and I'm going to show you a video. How can we recognise minority ethnic and religious minority religious people in our concept of Northern Ireland, including the historical narratives as well as the present day? And just to finish, I'm going to show you a really short video. This is one that I made for my current project, which is on Black history, and it just hopefully end with a little challenge, if I can make it play. Can you hear that okay?
I don't see colour has become a common phrase used to assert hatred of racism. While well-intentioned, it's often used because we don't feel comfortable talking about race. For many of us, it's also because we simply don't have to. We get to move through the world without thinking about that aspect of our identity, when we are seen as the default.
We cannot treat people's identity as unsane and unreasonable, especially not when it has real-world consequences. While race is a social construct, racism is real. People cannot make impact on what they don't see. We have to see color, recognize it, celebrate it, and challenge perception of it. We see color.
In Northern Ireland, we are fond of classification. We want to put people in boxes, PUL, CNR, and other. The danger of the term other is it implies people outside the two dominants are all the same. And it also implies that they don't really belong. And if someone isn't seen as really part of society or as not really belonging, it's much easier to dehumanize them.
The cherry picking of history, the focus only the dominant narratives, and the pleasing aspect of history leave us lacking context, lacking knowledge of our own development.
The exclusion of Black people's contributions and the historical injustices perpetrated against them gives us a false perception of ourselves and what it means to be Northern Irish, Irish, or British.
From the Black innovation that helped bring us light bulbs, the traffic light, open heart surgery, personal computers, and much more of the legacy of modernism and slavery that brought wealth to the country, on the blacks of slavery, ours, Black history is our history.
While there are many prominent figures who have contributed towards peace and development in recent years, there are many others whose stories have been forgotten and hidden. From World War heroes to educators and healthcare workers on the front line during the COVID-19 pandemic, their stories need to be told.
During Black History Month, we must squeeze 100 years of our history, the story of Black people, in the 31 days that can never be enough time. It's time to mainstream Black history into our history curriculum, present it in historical and cultural context.
Racism and xenophobia are one of ignorance. If history is taught at an early stage in schools, then we can fight racism and stereotypes against a section of the society, and our children can truly feel they belong.
Black history is Northern Irish history. It is Irish history. It is British history, and it is our history.
So there you go. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Naomi. That was really fascinating. I mean, I've heard you give talks on this topic before, and I always come away with my mind sort of blown a bit. No, it's really, really fascinating. I think one of the really powerful messages that came out of that video there, which sort of to paraphrase it, is if people are othered, then it's much easier to imply that they don't belong. And then through that, it's easier to dehumanize them, and then it becomes easier to discriminate against them. And I think that's just a really powerful message coming through that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's why, you know, there's this whole thing, well, they're not really from here, and that can perpetuate, particularly if someone looks different. If someone can blend in, well, you know, I can blend in a lot of the time, but, you know, if someone can't physically blend in because their skin's a different color, and you tell, you know, as part of this project, I've been interviewing people, and there's one lady, she was born in Northern Ireland, she's in her 50s, and she's still being asked, are you really Irish? And she's come to the point where she's like saying, well, I know this team, and I know, you know, and literally trying to show that she's Irish, but because her father came from Jamaica, and, you know, she doesn't know her father, she was raised by her white mother, because of how she looks, it's assumption she's not really Irish, she's not, you know, not really from here, and certain even things about her, like she's naturally a thief, or naturally negative things as well that associate stereotypes with her color. And it was heartbreaking, because this is a woman who's, you know, had children and lived here, and she's still having almost like being bullied in a playground or something, that she's not really one of us. And that's why it's so important that we do expand our minds and what we call Northern Irish or Irish or British, however you want to identify.
That's fascinating. What I'm going to do, I'm going to stop the recording and then I will open it up if anybody else has any questions to come in.